Hello, my name's David Runciman, and this is Past, Present, Future, the History of Ideas podcast. Today, it's part 2 of our 3 episodes about the people and the ideas behind the French Revolution, and we have reached Robespierre. I'm going to be talking to the historian Ruth Scurr, biographer of Robespierre, about the man himself and about some of the ideas that he represented. How did he ride this revolution all the way to the bitter, terrifying end? Ruth, maybe we should start with the man himself and what made him, before he arrived in Paris and became famous, eventually became world famous. What would you say were the things that shaped Robespierre? What were the biggest influences on the person who came to Paris?
So there's the family influences. He loses his mother very young, age 6, and then his somewhat dissolute father abandons the 4 siblings. Robespierre's the eldest. He becomes very serious, very protective, very diligent. He wants to make a life for himself, and he settles upon becoming a lawyer, which is a completely conventional choice. There had been lawyers in his family. And if the revolution had never happened, nobody would ever have heard of him. He would have been a perfectly decent provincial lawyer, often taking on cases that he considered to be the underdog or instances of a miscarriage of justice.
And what was the impact on him of his education? So intellectually, because he was a serious guy, as you say, and he was also an intellectual, what would you say were the biggest influences on his worldview? I don't know if you want to call it a philosophy at this point. I mean, lawyers have philosophies too. But what would you say before the revolution shaped Robespierre's understanding of how the world did work, how it should work?
Like everyone in his generation and his culture, religion would have been a huge influence on him. He was exposed to the practices, the rituals of the Catholic Church, and also understood that it was very, very powerful within society. But alongside that very conventional framework, which would have come through to him from his schooling, there was also the excitement of challenging ideas, challenging philosophies, and most prominent in that was his exposure to Jean-Jacques Rousseau. He was extremely excited by what was in effect a banned book, Emile. There are reports of this book circulating amongst his peers. It's by no means just him. And the really important idea that comes through to him is this possibility of the natural goodness of man, the Catholic idea of the fall and of the need for salvation is challenged in Emile. And Robespierre, along with many of his peers and some of his schoolmates, remain in his life. Some of them also get caught up in the revolution. But they would have been extremely excited by that subversive set of ideas coming through to them, not just from Rousseau, but he is extremely important.
And it's the Rousseau of Emile rather than the social contract. You know, there was, after the revolution, long after the revolution, some people wanted to blame Rousseau for it, including for the terror, including for Robespierre. But they tended to alight on the social contract as the book that they thought gave a sort of political, philosophical justification for oppression in the name of equality and justice. But this is a different kind of influence on him.
Yes, that's a retrospective reading that you've just been describing, and a very, very powerful one. The idea that the social contract was a sort of playbook for the revolution, that people had rather ingenuously grown up reading it and then decided to activate it, is a complete nonsense. Rousseau is really known for his novels, for Emile and La Nouvelle Louise, and the social contract is a relatively overlooked, pretty minor part of Rousseau's impact, certainly in terms of, Rousseau being a bestseller, Rousseau being a celebrity. It's the novels that are really important. But then retrospectively, of course, because the social contract is such a powerful rejection of illegitimate power, it becomes very tempting to attribute causation to that text. And we have sort of stories of Robespierre during the revolution going to bed with a copy of the social contract under his pillow, and et cetera, et cetera. And it is true, all of that said, that in the midst of the revolution, people do reach for the social contract and start thinking, well, what does he say about a great legislator and where do we find one of those? But I think prior to the revolution, it was certainly the wider cultural impact of Rousseau's subversive ideas coming through the novels, coming through Emile, which would have influenced Robespierre.
And given Robespierre's temperament, is it fair to say that one of the things that he was drawn to in Rousseau was a kind of idea or ideal of sincerity? That there's a way of being in the world which, without necessarily having a thought out political philosophy behind it, is about cutting through all of the superficiality and the show and getting down to the essence. And that you do see that in the Rousseau of the revolution too.
Yes, absolutely. There's the engagement with the idea of simplicity, the rejection of corruption, the suspicion of corrupt motivation, and the hope to honor and protect what is simple and good in human beings. That's absolutely right.
One more thing before we get to Paris, 1789. As a lawyer, one of the things that he did was oppose what he thought were cruel and unjust punishments, including capital punishments, which, again, I think with hindsight, people try and make that into part of the irony of his story. It was, I assume, sincere. What was the motivation? I mean, did he see it as a question of social justice?
In being an early campaigner against capital punishment, I think it's partly the wider debate about punishment and privilege. So this is a context where there is a more humane form of capital punishment for the aristocracy, and that involves the right to have your head quickly sliced off with a sword.
So it's relatively more humane, but it is more humane when people hear what the alternative is, right?
The alternative is being broken on the wheel, having horrific torture in a protracted, agonizing death. And so, in that context, there is obviously a huge amount of reflection upon the symbolic side of capital punishment and the judicial aspects of it. And one of the things the revolutionaries do very early on is say, well, it's got to be one humane form of punishment for all. And therefore, since we can't have these skilled people capable of slicing off heads very accurately all over the place, we're going to have a machine that does that. Now, Robespierre is actually against capital punishment from the beginning. And then when this becomes an issue in the revolution, that is one of the ways in which his ideas evolve, to think that actually there are circumstances in which it's going to be necessary. But his initial position is very sincerely one of opposing it.
When he arrived in Paris in 1789, so he got himself elected to the Estates General, like Sieyès did, the person who was the subject of our previous episode. And as we talked to Lucia Rubinelli about then, no one really knew what to expect. There were a whole host of ambitions projected onto this gathering, which this hadn't happened for 175 years. What do you think? Is it possible to know what Robespierre's initial hopes were when he got there, not just for himself, but so there wasn't a revolution yet, but for the possibility of radical change?
That's a very, very important, very interesting question, because I don't think at all that Robespierre was a constitutional theorist or even an intellectual in the same league as Sieyès. He does have ideas, and some of them are relatively striking, such as he's very clear about the importance of elections. He's got a lot of very early proto-democratic ideas. And he also has a very strong sense of there being enemies of the people. enemies of the ordinary people, enemies of the good nature and simple nature of the people. So those two things together are, in some sense, a kind of DNA of democratic ideas later on. And he's very, very early into that. Whereas Sieyès is really envisaging the representative system of the modern world. He's spent time in libraries looking at other political theorists. He's interested in constitutional design. He's thought about that. Robespierre's nowhere near this at all. He's got an intuitive sense of the importance of elections, an intuitive sense that ordinary people get betrayed by richer, more corrupt, and more powerful people. And that's where he's coming from. He's not an intellectual in the same class as Sieyès. And I'm not diminishing him. I'm not saying he's not important, and clearly he's hugely important. But I'm saying that the range of his political thinking is in a different register from Sieyès.
And by ordinary people, can we say that means the poor? Would it be possible to say of him in 1789 that if he had had to say who his people were, it wasn't just, as it was for Sieyès, the productive element of French society. It was the oppressed, it was the poor.
Yes, it was. So it's important. I mean, Robespierre doesn't come from a totally impoverished family. His family had the de Robespierre originally, so that means they're not manual labourers. But he's very, very close, partly through being orphaned, being parcelled out as a child. He's very much closer to that sense of the totally excluded, the poor, even the indigent. And one of the things, for example, that Hilary Mantel loved about Robespierre, and she and I, we did speak a lot about him before and after I was writing my book, and because of her interest in A Place of Greater Safety. And she thought he was one of history's heroes because he was one of the few people who had genuinely engaged with trying to speak on behalf of the poor.
And would he have thought of that as a Christian vision in the sense that, as you said, religion was a big part of his upbringing, and this was a religious world, and he definitely wasn't an atheist. He becomes quite stridently anti-atheistic, if that's a word. But was it also a feeling that someone else who had done this was Jesus Christ, and it was in the mold of early Christianity, and that Christianity itself is an example of one of those things that once was for the poor and had become a corrupt and oppressive system that stood up for the people with money and power?
His relationship to Catholicism and the church is quite unstable during the early revolution. So, on the one hand, yes, he does have a sense of those prototypical Christian values which are focused upon the poor and value not the material things and trying to engage with that. But then he also has some kind of quite radical and strange interventions from the point of view of his Catholic upbringing, where he suddenly decides, there's nothing wrong with priests being married. What's everyone's problem? Why shouldn't priests be married? And then his brother's writing to him saying, look, that's playing really badly back here in Arras.
You're frightening people.
Would you just not bring up the subject of celibacy in the middle of the revolution? Why are you even talking about that? So there's some obvious engagement, there's a resonance. I don't think of him as someone having an intense relationship with the historical or liturgical Christ figure. For him, it is more going in the deist direction of that celebration of a natural force of goodness somewhere in the world. And I think he does, in that respect, echo Rousseau. There's an overlap there.
He and Sieyès both find themselves in the Estates General, in the Third Estate, which then becomes the National Assembly. It also becomes a constituent assembly. As you said, for Sieyès, the job is to go away, work out what the constitution should be, and then try and often fail to get it through the assembly. Robespierre, I'm sure this is almost the one thing that everyone will know about him because it's the word that's associated with him. The thing that he does outside of the assembly is not exclusively, but primarily through a club, the Jacobin Club. And that becomes the basis for his influence over the assembly. How did he he believes in elections, and presumably he believes, therefore, that the institutions that end up governing France should be elected institutions. How did he square that with the role of the Jacobin Club? What was the idea of a club as the driving force of a revolutionary movement?
Well, the club evolved. It moved politically as well. So it was set up as a kind of talking shop originally in a sort of cafe before it takes up its residence in the old Jacobin premises and then takes on the name. And it's a club for sort of chatting about what's happening in the Constituent Assembly. And then as the members become more integrated with the actual representatives, so Robespierre is one of them, it's a forum to try out speeches. So sometimes Robespierre will deliver to the Jacobin Club a speech that he's either has delivered in the Constituent Assembly or is planning on delivering in the Constituent Assembly. So it's a genuine sort of forum for political commentary and certain amount of rehearsal and a certain amount of discussion as to strategy going on. And then it grows up a network of these clubs all over France. So there's not just the Parisian ones, they're in other places, and there's a correspondence network between them. And so they're publishing speeches and circulating them to their affiliated clubs and things like that. So it doesn't start off as his power base at all. It's more his sort of talking shop and lots of other people's as well. And then they go through their periodic fracturing where moderates leave. So Sieyès and actually Condorcet, another hugely important intellectual, they were originally interested in being in this club and talking, and then they sort of withdraw from it, and then it becomes stronger and stronger. And at the point at which Robespierre is actually in power, the Jacobin Club is really supporting him and his closest allies at that point. But that was not the case earlier on. It's a sort of political situation that evolved.
And is it possible to say what his hold was over the club in that, as you say, it starts off as a talking shop. There are lots of interesting, smart people, and presumably some also less interesting and less smart people, but it becomes his personal power base. Was it the force of his oratory? Was it the force of his personality? Was it the fact that he was pushing the revolution in a radical direction, and as the moderates fell away, it became a sort of concentration of radical energy?
The latter, there's definitely an element of that by the time he becomes really powerful, a lot of the people who were opposed to him or might have stood up against him have left. And they've either gone off into other clubs or tried to make a difference in a different way. Sieyès, for example, Condorcet, or, they've been imprisoned and in some cases they're dead. On the matter of, was he charismatic and how do we understand why his speeches, his claim to speak on behalf of the revolution was taken as seriously as it was, that is really inscrutable. Because when you read the speeches, I'm not saying it has, it's got some good lines and things, but, you don't pick it up and think, wow, actually not in the way in which Thomas Paine, you pick up the text of Paine, and Paine's a fantastic force on the page.
Or Danton? I mean, doesn't Danton have some of that?
Yeah, he does. And also Demoulin has it. Marat, for goodness sake, has it in spades. He's always making some kind of hugely flamboyant tabloid pronouncement that goes absolutely viral in the middle of the revolution. Robespierre really doesn't. I mean, he's still that prissy, fastidious, slightly hesitant lawyer, and he's always kind of got his drafts and he's always going to go through them and everything. But allegedly, he stands up and he's electrifying. Now, at a certain point, I imagine that's because he's so powerful. But earlier on, I mean, it's quite amusing bits where he thinks he's going to make a speech and he doesn't get the opportunity and he's really annoyed and all the rest of it. And then his speech gets cut off or something like that. So I don't think he is a powerful orator, even though there are accounts of him holding the Constituent Assembly and then later in the convention holding, and in the Jacobin Club, obviously, holding the audience captive. And it is hard to reconstruct that from the printed page.
The other source of his power, as well as the club, was for want of a better phrase, the street. He was one of those revolutionaries who, at a certain point, I'm not sure exactly when, realized that one of the ways to galvanize the revolution, but also to hold the Constituent Assembly to account in the name of the people or the poor, was to speak up on behalf of radical forces out there in Parisian society, including literally on the streets. I think it's fair to say that. Is it true that at a certain point he realized that the energy of the revolution was the streets of Paris? I mean, Paris becomes the center of all of this, partly because Robespierre, among other people, makes sure that the streets of Paris drive the revolution in a more radical direction. Does it become a Paris revolution in his hands?
The causation there is very hard to pin down because there's a sense in which right from the beginning of the revolution, when there are lynchings of the aristocrats, there is a queasy compromise with street violence. And there's this moment when Barnave, who's actually a pro-monarch deputy at the beginning, and complaining about these lynchings, and turns around and says, well, was their blood so pure? Kind of thing. And it's a chilling moment where you see that these people, they know that there is a compromise to be made with the bloodletting in the street. And that gets more and more intense. And the big climax of it is the September massacres, when the crowd, I got told off in reviews of my book for using the word mob. Apparently, you're not supposed to use this, but actually it was a mob, went into the prisons and massacred the prisoners who were in there. Many of them were priests who'd been arrested on suspicion. So it was very early. It's a sort of first indication of the prominence of revolutionary violence. It's after the fall of the monarchy, which is August. So it's between the fall of the monarchy and the trial, the 2nd to the 6th of September, 1792. And it is an outbreak of violence. And it's after that the first version of the Revolutionary Tribunal is established. And then that was sort of worked up into the famous Revolutionary Tribunal, before which, you could be hauled up because your neighbour suspected you of counter-revolutionary activity. So again, you can see the revolutionary institutions are sort of keeping pace with the violence. And I think that the politicians involved are riding the tide of it. They have to try and judge how they're going to keep their constitutional aspirations on board, how they're going to promote those in these pretty feral circumstances. And they have to try and negotiate the unpredictability of the violence. And of course, it is that violence that in the end brings Robespierre down, comes for him.
Before the fall of the king, my understanding is that Robespierre was one of those many people he wasn't an out-and-out Republican. I mean, the fate of the king was not for him the central question here. The central question here was an idea of social justice, and it didn't necessarily require a republic. But after the fall of the king, and indeed in the debates about whether or not the king should lose his head, Robespierre, it's one of the things that drives him to the prominent position that he eventually achieves in the radical phase of the revolution, becomes a staunch advocate of Republican politics. Is it possible to make sense of cause and effect in that, in the sense that, does he become a Republican because he's riding the wave, or does he in part shape the wave because he comes to a real conviction that this is the way the revolution has to go?
Everyone comes to that conclusion once the king has fallen, because that's the end of the monarchy. So this scrabbling around is like, oh, and now we do have to have a republic. How do we do one of those? And that is the debate between Sieyès and Paine, where Sieyès is saying, look, we hear you, Paine. We don't want a king. You've got to go a bit further than that. That's not enough. We need to know what kinds of, how do you configure an executive? How do you hold it accountable if it's Republican rather than monarchical, and all of that design issue? Robespierre's not really interested so much in that. What galvanizes him is Saint-Just. So Saint-Just gets elected to the convention after the fall of the monarchy, and he arrives, and there's this wonderful description of him sort of carrying his head like the consecrated host into the convention. Yeah, he's this wild, totally forensic, completely dynamic thinker about the way in which the king, the deposed king, and the revolution are in opposition to each other. And so when people want to have a debate, what are we going to do with this king? Let's be humane. Could we export him? Maybe we could put him in jail, etc. Saint-Just says, no, absolutely not. You put the king on trial, you're putting the revolution on trial. And if the king is innocent, where does that leave the revolution? So that man, he reigns or he dies. And Robespierre is riveted by this speech and immediately sees the power of it. And he's right in there with Saint-Just in those speeches on the trial of the king. And that's a real pivotal moment in his life. And he becomes completely then committed to demonizing the king, the royal family, etc. And that this is the only way forward for the revolution is to engage in that total binary relationship to the past.
One of the other things that he has to shift on is the question of whether or not this revolution is going to be defended through war, conventional European warfare, because, again, to start with, he is an opponent of war. War is the thing that you're fighting against. War is the thing that produces the sort of oppression that the revolution is designed to get rid of. But Republican France, which is going to be under attack from the monarchies of Europe, is going to have to defend itself. As he makes these shifts, does he, I mean, it's very hard to answer this kind of question about what goes on inside someone's head, but does he think he's being consistent, or does he think he is adapting and making compromises to circumstance? Because he presents himself as a politician of high principle. That is his calling card, after all. And yet here he is, he has to go from not necessarily being a Republican to being an absolutely staunch Republican. It's the king's death or our death. He has to go from being an opponent of war to being a champion of the kind of war that the Republic is going to need to fight.
I think it's difficult to hold him to academic consistency standards in that way. You've just contradicted yourself in the middle of a revolution. Guess what I have? Because I never foresaw that the monarchy would fall. I never foresaw that not only would we have a civil war, but also a foreign war and the whole of Europe against us. So you're absolutely right. Initially, he's against war, and he's against war for some of those reasons that go back to his very earliest political instincts. He thinks in war, the privileged will benefit, and that the revolution will be betrayed, the ordinary people will be betrayed, not only because they'll be sent off as foot soldiers and slaughtered on the front line, which is certainly true, but because then even if they win the war, that will be a reason for those generals to return. And this is almost foreseeing Napoleon. The generals will come back, and then the generals will have huge political power. And that's what happens in war, as he understands it. So originally he's saying, no, that's not our revolution. We don't need to do our revolution through war. Everyone will see how marvelous our revolution is, because our revolution will establish the Universal Declaration of Rights, and everybody will join in with it. We don't need to take it abroad through war. But then guess what? Actually, it's coming for you. It's not that you're taking it abroad, but actually after the execution of the king, it was a galvanizing moment for European powers. So absolutely going to war with France, even countries who'd been holding off before then. And there's a civil war, because there are lots of people throughout France. And Burke foresaw this as well. Burke said early on, he said, for every priest that won't sign that new civil constitution of the clergy will become a focus for the counter-revolution. And of course, the counter-revolution is what drives the rhetoric of Robespierre and others into that totally paranoid space where it's your friends and your enemies, and the paranoia involved in that kind of mindset.
As you said, he's not an intellectual like Sieyès or Condorcet, so maybe this isn't a fair question, but with the case of many of the intellectuals at the heart of the revolution, one of the things that they were very interested in is how this revolution compares to other revolutions, particularly the American Revolution, but also, so on the question of the trial of the king, people would be thinking of what had played out in England 150 years earlier. Did Robespierre think about how this revolution could or should be different from those other ones? So, for instance, in the case of the American Revolution, because the language of anti-federalist gets borrowed, doesn't it? Or it gets deployed in the case of the French Revolution. And Robespierre is a proud anti-federalist. I think he calls one of his publications the Anti-Federalist. Is that in reference to what's going on in the United States? Is he trying to signal what's different here?
I think Robespierre's rhetoric is much more parochial. I don't see him as someone who had sort of 5 minutes to reflect once the revolution starts. It's like kind of getting into one of those rides in a theme park, you're strapped in 1789 and it goes right the way through. And I don't think he's reflecting on previous revolutions in England or what's happened in America. The Federalist, anti-Federalist language means something really specific, which it's basically the Jacobins against the Girondin faction, because the Girondins come from outside of Paris and they're not a sort of uniform group, but they come together to complain about the dominance of Paris over the revolution. And there's also included in that group, Paine is on the periphery of it, Condorcet is on the periphery of it, Sierra's a little bit, but they're all people who are more moderate than they perceive Robespierre, Saint-Just, Marat to be. And so when Robespierre is talking about these so-called federalists, really that's a way of describing the movement to pull the revolution back from being as Paris-centred as it had become, and he would have perceived that as obviously threatening to his power, which is, Robespierre hardly ever goes anywhere in his life. He's born in Arras. He goes to school in Paris, he goes home to Arras, he comes back to Paris once more, goes back to Arras, and then he's back in Paris and he dies. So he doesn't have that broader sense of comparative revolutions, particularly, and the threat to decenter the revolution from Paris would have been perceived by him as very threatening. And that comes out in what happened in Lyon. Robespierre is very involved in that. It is a completely brutal suppression of the counter-revolution in Lyon to the point where Lyon no longer exists.
Without it deliberately or even inadvertently echoing the arguments that are going on in the United States, is it still the case that one of the points of difference between anti-federalist, federalist, Jacobin, Girondin goes back to Robespierre's belief in direct forms of democracy, in the sense that the anti-federalists in the United States, one of the things that they stood for, or rather, one of the things that they stood against, was the complicated federal constitution and the way in which it seemed to dilute the representation of the ordinary people and their view that the ordinary people should be in their equivalent of the assembly. And that is one of Robespierre's core beliefs, isn't it? That he speaks for the ordinary people, but also the revolution needs to give the ordinary people some kind of direct voice. And you could say of Sieyès' constitutional arrangements that it did everything possible to dilute that direct voice. That was the point of his complex understanding of representation, which does have a bit more in common with American federal thought. So even if it's not deliberate, there are some possible echoes there.
Well, insofar as the anti-federalists in the United States and Robespierre in France are both very focused on direct democracy as opposed to representative or remote government, yes, I think so. But the only caveat there is that by direct democracy, I do think Robespierre has something quite filtered in mind. And this becomes apparent once he's in power. So it's one thing to be advocating direct democracy and more role for the people when you're in opposition. And then once you're actually in power, in his case, he's never a despot. He's one of 12 in this Committee of Public Safety trying to stave off all those wars, etc. But once in that position, he starts to shut down direct democracy. And actually, women's clubs are one of the first who's kind of say, all right, we actually are fighting a war here. The future of the revolution is in jeopardy. And censorship is fine in these circumstances. And we can't have much more of this disruptive free association going on. So that's another example of his principles morphing as his travel through the revolution progresses. And he ends up in that position where, although, yes, he has always advocated direct democracy, he's always been suspicious of those who claim to speak on behalf of the people, even though he is happy himself to speak on behalf of the people. There comes a point where he is sufficiently worried about the actual business of government. That's how are you going to actually save the revolution? How are you going to sort out the economy? How are you going to deal with this war to start moving in a more authoritarian direction than he would have been comfortable with earlier on?
The word that eventually gets associated with that more authoritarian direction is terror, and it is a word that he used himself. This isn't a post hoc label calling it the terror. The architects of the terror called it, in part, occasionally, terror. And he talked about terror and he talked about virtue in the same breath. I think it's fair to say in some of these speeches. I mean, some of the lines that do stand out are when he talks about the need for terror in the name of virtue. How does that work? In his version of this, it's not Rousseau, although I imagine Rousseau lurks somewhere in the background of some of it, though Rousseau wouldn't use the language of terror. But virtue, certainly, it's Rousseau and virtue. How are terror and virtue reconcilable in Robespierre's mind, do you think?
Well, you could say because he totally lost his mind at that point.
I mean, we are now 1794, I think. The roller coaster has reached pretty much a vertical drop at this point.
What he actually argues, and you're right, I mean, it is one of the most striking of the speeches. And he says, look, virtue cannot survive without terror because it's too weak, it's too vulnerable. It's like saying goodness or the undefended. It requires the presence of terror to ensure that it is not destroyed or corrupted. And obviously, terror without virtue is monstrous. But virtue without terror is totally pointless because it's completely vulnerable, because the powerful, the greedy, the strong, the corrupt, they will always stamp all over virtue because they are cynical and they are selfish. And for them, what politics is getting something for themselves. And if you do not defend virtue as the emanation of the goodness of the general will of the people, you're absolutely right. No one can even talk about virtue without thinking about Rousseau at this point. If you don't do that, then you're just condemning virtue to be martyred, really.
The paranoia, this is a familiar story from lots of revolutions, which is the people who get encompassed in the language of the elite, the privileged, the enemies, starts to include people who had originally been fellow revolutionaries. And as the circle shrinks, the people who are finding themselves on the outside have to get tarred with that brush. We thought that they were on our side. It turns out they were on the side of the people that we're fighting. There is no other word for it. Robespierre becomes more and more paranoid, and many, many people lose their lives as a result. It's not just him, but he's a driving force behind it. He's the one who ends up condemning Danton, for instance. Is it temperamental? Is it just, as it were, something to do with his personality? Or can we say that there is an intellectual rationale behind it? Because as you just described it, there is an intellectual rationale behind it. This is of a piece with his earlier view about where the battle lines are drawn between the oppressors and the oppressed. But once the oppressors start to include people like Danton, it starts to look just mad.
I think both can be true. I think there is absolutely an element of collective madness in this story. And it's one of the reasons why it's so fascinating, because it's so extreme. And we continue to go back to this because the characters are so extraordinary and the time frame is so tight and the outcome is so dramatic. But I also think that the friend-enemy rhetoric, which drives the paranoia, it's like, how do you know who your friends are in politics at the best of times?
And these are not the best of times.
If you're in the middle of a revolution, which includes a civil and a foreign war, and you've seen people going under the guillotine, that question, who can I trust? Who are my real friends? Who's going to stab me in the back? Probably does drive you completely mad. And there are signs, when towards the end of his life, he starts to withdraw. He's sort of ill for some of that time. And then he thinks he can just go back into the convention and make a speech and it's going to turn it all around. But that friend enemy distinction, it's not just him, it's the whole revolution. It's the idea that, and this particularly chilling idea, that it's the person who seems to be most pro the revolution that is really your enemy. Because why would they be pretending to be so in favor of the revolution? It's a sort of strange, contorted language of communicating those loyalties in a really, really frenetic space. And I think would probably drive everyone crazy. And it was absolutely crazy for Robespierre to betray those friends. Danton Desmoulins, he'd known them from before the revolution. He was the godfather of Desmoulins' child, these things. But in the moment, he believes they have become corrupted from the true cause of the revolution, and he convinces himself that he is not. And again, even on that point, paranoia is such an interesting subject in fascinating novels, etc. And there's always this element of absolute truth running through paranoia. It's what sort of spins it and becomes so compelling in novels about it. The fact of the matter is, as Danton was the first to admit, Robespierre was incorruptible. He wasn't corrupt. He wasn't interested in sex. He wasn't interested in money. The rest of them actually were.
I mean, it's also one of the pitfalls of making sincerity your ultimate test of political loyalty, because once it's known that sincerity is the test, then the question is, how do we know whose protestations of sincerity are sincere and whose are fake? And then you're in a kind of, an endless spiral. You're down a rabbit hole, because I think we know that in lots of different forms of politics, which is the elevation of sincerity to the ultimate badge of honor usually leads to a kind of bloodbath, actually, or a literal bloodbath, never mind a kind of bloodbath.
Yeah, first stop the guillotine.
In your book, there's a passage, sort of extended sequence, which is completely haunting, which is at the end of his life. But one of the things that makes it haunting is your description of the best day of Robespierre's life, which is the festival of the celebration of the Supreme Being, which is only a matter of weeks before the end of his life. And, it's one of the most distinctive features about him. As the revolution is descending into paranoia and terror, as it's shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, and the perspective of the people involved is shrinking, it's sort of, can I trust the person 5 yards away from me, never mind the people in Lyon? This extraordinary, expansive conception of the civil religion that's going to underpin the revolution gets an airing. And I just want to read one bit, which is the account of what is going to be celebrated in the various festivals that it's hoped they never come to pass, because this thing's all going to collapse in on itself. But what it's hoped is going to be celebrated and drive the revolution and become the animating spirit of the revolution. Article 7 says that the Republic shall celebrate on successive decade days. So we're in a 10-day week here, but let's call them successive Sundays. The following festivals: the Supreme Being and nature, the human race, the French people, the benefactors of mankind, the martyrs of freedom, liberty and equality, the Republic, the liberty of the world, patriotism, hatred of tyrants and traitors, truth, justice, modesty, glory and immortality, friendship, temperance, courage, good faith, heroism, impartiality, stoicism, love, conjugal fidelity, fatherly affection, mother love, filial piety, childhood, youth, manhood, old age, misfortune, agriculture, industry, our ancestors, posterity, happiness. as the revolution shrinks, it also, in Robespierre's mind, it explodes. I've never seen such a list. I mean, the idea that you could found a religion on that range of ideals, it's everything. Did he believe in it? What was his relationship to this new religion?
He absolutely believed in it. He was totally sincere. And all around him, even on the day itself when he parades up the paper mache mountain that David has constructed for him in his sky blue coat with his bouquet of wild flowers and wheat, even on that day, there are people behind him sniggering at this ridiculous ceremony that's going on. And for him, it is totally serious. He thinks that it is a way to reconcile the best part of the old religion, so Roman Catholicism, with the people's need for some ongoing spiritual structure that is not corrupt. So we're not talking the old clergy and all those archbishops who are just kind of in it for themselves, but it's the essence of what is good in human beings, and he thinks this is going to be like a panacea. It's what people need. He thinks, and it's a very interesting reflection, he thinks that atheism is aristocratic. You can't be an atheist unless you're some form of intellectual, basically.
The people are not atheists.
According to him, I mean, maybe that's no longer true now, but at the time when he's writing that, he can see that the people who are excited by and compelled by atheistic ideas are refined, niche intellectuals. Everybody else could actually do without being told that on top of everything else, there is no God.
And as you say, people were sniggering. He was completely sincere. People were sniggering at him. And of course, to go back to what I said earlier, this is one of the problems of making politics about sincerity, because in the end, it was Robespierre's own sincerity. He was the incorruptible. He was, in many ways, the one person who could say, I've been sincere throughout this. But by this point, he has started to look ridiculous. And it looks a bit like an act. It's a papier-mâché mountain, for God's sake. He may be completely sincere in his faith in it, but it looks like dressing up. It's the beginning of the end. The happiest day of his life is also the beginning of the end.
And it also looks very vain, which is another thing. There's a sort of narcissism there. This description of his very modest living quarters, but they're sort of surrounded by all these pictures and medallions and representations of himself that people have given him. And partly you can see from his point of view, what are you supposed to do? It's like if you're in a conference abroad and somebody gives you a gift, you don't leave it behind, you bring it home with you, etc. So he's been given all these sort of recognitions of himself, and they're all assembled allegedly in this room where he is. But from another perspective, that does look very vain. And on designing this first outing of the Festival of the Supreme Being, with himself at the centre point, leading the deputies up the paper mache mountain, just slightly ahead of everybody else in a slightly better costume. It is open to the charge that, well, actually, you're really not as incorruptible as you think you are. And okay, maybe what you want out of this is a bit weird. Most people would want sex or money or property, and you seem to want
A papier-mâché mountain and a new religion.
with yourself at the centre of the set. Okay.
I want to ask you one last question. You can completely refuse to answer it because it's impossible to answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. The end, when it comes very quickly. And again, this is of a piece with the pace at which the revolution is moving through the summer of 1794. The bloodletting is relentless, but also the churn of who's a friend and who's an enemy. And at the end, Robespierre can no longer command the assembly. His traditional support, the street, the Jacobin Club, isn't enough to save him. He and Saint-Just go down together. But it happens very quickly. It happens in a matter of days, essentially. Do you think there's any way of knowing where Robespierre would think it had gone wrong, in the sense that it seems implausible that it went wrong right at the end? Like it was all going okay until last Tuesday, and that's when it fell apart. Who knows what he thought on the guillotine? Did his life flash before his eyes? And he was in terrible pain, apart from anything else, because he tried to shoot himself, hadn't he? So his jaw was broken.
Either he tried or someone had shot at him. I think he tried to shoot himself, but other people have argued, no, he wouldn't have done that. It was someone shot him. But, on that subject, what was in his mind, it is so haunting. And this was a wonderful line in something Hilary Mantel wrote about him that I've always remembered. Just shows her absolute genius and envisaging that historical moment where he's lying there, he's shot off half his jaw. On the wall, there is a copy of the Universal Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. And allegedly, at that point, he asked for a pen and he wasn't given one. And she wrote, I would have given him a pen.
We are extremely grateful for the many, many messages that we get about this podcast, including lots and lots of suggestions and ideas about the episodes that we've done, but also about possible episodes for the future. We are aware, we are a tiny team, that we're not able to respond to all of these messages, but we did want to let you know that we read them all and we really do appreciate them all. Thank you, and do keep them coming. More revolutionary ideas from us, but also more from you. Very welcome. Next time in this series, the third of our episodes about the French Revolution, it's about the man who bridges the American Revolution, the French Revolution, and is in many ways the great revolutionary figure of the age. We're going to be talking about someone who has come up already in this series, but we are going to be giving him the attention he deserves. Thomas Paine. That's next time. This has been Past, Present, Future, part of the Airwave Podcast Network.